The carriage door opened onto the gravel sweep of Harrogate Hall, and Eleanor Vance stepped down into the cold November dusk, with no one beside her and no one behind her. The other guests had arrived in pairs and in families, mothers steering daughters, fathers nodding to grooms, every party announced by a footman who knew exactly which name belonged to which face. Eleanor had been announced by no one. Her name had not been on the original list. She had come because a letter, 3 weeks old and folded too many times, had summoned her to a house she had never seen, on the strength of a connection she could no longer prove. The footman at the door looked at her plain gray traveling cloak, at the single small trunk a tired boy carried behind her, at the absence of any gentleman to give her countenance, and his face arranged itself into the particular blankness that servants of great houses reserve for women who have arrived wrongly. A woman in the doorway behind him said it first, low and clear, to the companion at her elbow. A lady does not arrive without an escort. She said it the way one states a law of nature, the way one might say that water runs downhill. Eleanor heard every word. She kept her chin level and her gloves smooth, and she did not let her face change, because she had learned, in the long months since her father's death, that the only thing the world could not take from a woman who had lost everything else was the discipline of her own expression. What none of them saw in that first cold moment was the man standing at the tall window of the entrance hall, half in shadow, who had turned at the sound of wheels on gravel and had not turned back. He watched her cross the threshold alone. He watched the doorway woman's mouth move and the color stay even in Eleanor's cheek. He did not know her name yet. He would remember the straightness of her back before he learned it. Stay with me, because the woman the room had already decided to forget is the one this whole house will be arranged around before the season turns, and the man at the window is going to spend everything he has to make it so. Eleanor had not wanted to come. She had read the letter 4 times in the lodging house in Bath, where she had taken 2 cold rooms after the creditors finished with her father's estate, and each time the words had meant the same impossible thing. The late Earl of Marbury had named in a codicil to his will a small annuity for the daughter of a man he had once called the truest friend of his youth. The daughter was Eleanor. The man had been her father, Captain Vance, dead, now of a fever that the physicians had charged 3 guineas to fail to cure. The annuity was modest. The condition attached to it was strange. She was to present herself, in person, at Harrogate Hall, before the new Earl, within the month, or the bequest would lapse to the estate. So she had sold her mother's garnet brooch to pay for the post-chaise, and she had come, and she had arrived, as the woman in the doorway had observed, without an escort, because there was no one left in the world to escort her. The new Earl of Marbury was the man at the window, though Eleanor did not learn this for another hour. His name was Adrian Hale, and he had inherited the title and the house and the entailed acres 8 months earlier from an uncle he had respected and a cousin he had loved, both gone inside a single brutal winter. He was 34, tall, dark, with a kind of stillness that other men mistook for coldness and that frightened them more than temper would have, because a man who shouts can be answered, and a man who is silent cannot. He spoke little. He missed nothing. The house had filled with guests for the long-promised autumn gathering his late cousin had planned in better days, and Adrian had let it fill because cancelling would have meant explaining, and explaining was the one thing he could not do. He moved through his own rooms like a man visiting them, touching nothing, claiming nothing, sleeping in a chamber that was not the Earl's chamber because he could not yet make himself lie down in a dead man's bed. He had not yet decided whether the title fit him or whether he was merely wearing it, until someone arrived to take it away from him, and some nights he half hoped someone would. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pennock, was the one who found Eleanor standing in the cold hall, while the other guests were shown up to rooms with fires already lit. Pennock was a square, gray, unhurried woman who had served the family for 30 years, and who had buried 2 earls and a countess, and was not easily impressed by the living. She looked at Eleanor's gray cloak, and her level chin and the letter Eleanor held out, and something in her own face shifted, just slightly, from duty to attention. She read the seal. She read the name. She did not say a lady does not arrive without an escort. She said, "Follow me, miss, and your room is at the end of the east passage, and it is small, but the chimney draws well, and I will see you have a fire within the half hour." It was the first kindness Eleanor had been shown since Bath, and it nearly undid the discipline of her face. She did not let it. She thanked Mrs. Catterber, Pennock in a steady voice, and she climbed the back stairs to the small room at the end of the east passage, past the good bedrooms with their fires already lit, and their warming pans and their maids laying out gowns for the evening, to the plain door at the end where the housekeeper had said the chimney drew well. The room was small and clean and cold, with a narrow bed and a narrow window that looked down over the kitchen gardens to the grey chapel beyond, and Eleanor stood in it for a moment and let herself feel just once and briefly the full size of how far she had fallen. From the captain's daughter who had kept his house and read his charts, and danced at the assembly rooms, to a woman with one trunk in a borrowed room at the wrong end of a stranger's passage. Then she set the feeling down, because she had learned that feelings, like grief, could be set down and taken up later. She set her father's miniature on the narrow mantel, the little oval portrait painted when he was young and whole and laughing, the only thing of his she had not been forced to sell. And she sat on the edge of the hard bed, and she did not weep, because weeping was a thing she had decided she would do later, in some kinder year that could afford it. True to her word, Mrs. Pennock sent up a fire within the half hour, carried by a silent girl who looked at Eleanor with frank curiosity and said nothing, and the small room warmed and the captain's painted face caught the new firelight and seemed almost to move. The woman in the doorway had a name too. She was Lady Drummond, widow of a baronet, sister to the late countess, and she had appointed herself the keeper of Harrowgate's dignity in the absence of any countess to keep it. She had brought her daughter Cassandra, a pretty polished girl of 20, with a great deal of pale blue silk, and a laugh she had been taught to use at exactly the right moments, and Lady Drummond had arrived at the gathering with one clear and reasonable purpose. The new Earl was unmarried. Cassandra was eligible. The house wanted a countess. Lady Drummond intended to supply one, and she did not intend to be interrupted in the supplying by a grey-cloaked nobody who had come up the drive alone with a creased letter and a borrowed boy. That first evening, at dinner, Eleanor was seated at the very foot of the long table, below a deaf clergyman who addressed every remark to the wrong neighbor, and a young man named Pelham who talked only of his horses. Adopted a bay mare he had bought at Tattersall's, and a chestnut he had been cheated over, and a hunter he meant to acquire if his father would only see reason. Eleanor listened to all of it, and made the small, encouraging sounds that cost a woman nothing, and bought her a quiet evening, and she watched the candlelight move along the great length of the table to the silver and the diamonds, and the bright, untroubled faces of people who had never once in their lives arrived anywhere without an escort. She had expected nothing else, and she received exactly that. The footman filled her glass, and did not look at her. The cream of her gown sat among the silks like a moth among butterflies, and she knew it, and she had decided in Bath that she would not apologize for it, not by so much as a lowered eye. But she noticed, because she had trained herself to notice everything, in a room where she had no power, that the Earl at the head of the table did not eat. He answered when spoken to. He inclined his head at the correct intervals. He let Lady Drummond arrange Cassandra at his right hand, and he let Cassandra laugh at the correct moments. And through all of it his eyes moved once, twice, 3 times, down the length of the table to the grey-cloaked woman at the foot, and away again before anyone could have marked it. Anyone but Eleanor, who marked everything. She told herself she had imagined it. She told herself a man like that did not look at a woman like her. Her hand, resting on the stem of a wine-glass she had not touched, was perfectly steady. The pulse in her wrist was not. The next morning Eleanor rose early, before the house had stirred, and went out into the cold for air, because the small room had pressed on her in the night, and the miniature on the mantel had watched her not sleep. The frost lay white and brittle on the lawns, and her breath went before her in clouds. and the great house behind her was dark in all its windows but one. The estate grounds ran down to a churchyard, an old grey chapel with leaning stones furred with lichen, and a single black yew where the rooks kept up a low complaint, and she walked there because the dead, at least, did not require an escort. It was there, among the stones, that she found the boy. He was perhaps 6, in a coat too good for crawling, blue wool with brass buttons, and he had got himself stuck where the churchyard wall had crumbled, one small boot wedged deep in the gap between the fallen stones, and he was not crying, which was worse than crying, because he had the white-set face of a child who has decided that no one is coming. Eleanor knelt in the wet grass without a thought for her one good gown, the cold soaking through to her knees, and she worked his foot free of the stones with slow, careful hands, talking the whole time in a low, even voice, about nothing at all, about the frost on the leaning markers, and the rooks and the black yew, and the way the chapel bell must sound across the fields on a Sunday morning, until the white left his face, and something easier came into it, and his fingers, which had been gripping the wall, loosened and reached instead for her sleeve. His name was Thomas. He was the Earl's ward, the orphaned son of the cousin who had died, and he had run out alone at dawn, for the same reason Eleanor had, because the house was full of people who looked through him. She did not know any of this as she brushed the dirt from his coat. She only knew that a child had been frightened, and was now not frightened, and that this was a thing worth being late to breakfast for. She walked him back across the grounds with his cold hand in hers, and she did not see the man standing at the upper window of the east wing, perfectly still, who had watched a grey-cloaked stranger kneel in the mud to free a child no one else in his house had thought to miss. Adrian stood at that window for a long time after they had gone in. He had spent 8 months unable to reach the boy, who flinched from him as from a stranger, and he had just watched a woman he did not know undo in a quarter hour what he had failed to do in 200 days. He did not understand it. He understood only that he wished to know her name, and that the wish frightened him more than the title did. He learned it that afternoon in the library, where he had gone to be alone among the only company that asked nothing of him, and found her instead, returning a book to a high shelf she had no business knowing the order of. She froze when she saw him, a slim volume still in her gloved hand, caught where a woman of her station was not meant to be. She began the proper apology, the retreat, the lowering of the eyes that her position required, and that she had performed 1,000 times in 14 months. He stopped her with 2 words, spoken low and level, in the voice the whole house found cold and that she was beginning to hear differently. By stay, please. The please was the thing. He was not a man who said please to servants, and they both knew it. And the word hung in the firelit air, between the leather spines. And then after a silence in which the fire shifted, and a log fell and sent up a small storm of sparks, he asked her name, and she gave it. Eleanor. Daughter of Captain Vance, here on the strength of a letter she could not prove, and would not be sorry to have tried, and she watched his face change at her father's name not greatly. For his face did not do great things, but the way still water changes when something moves beneath the surface. Captain Vance, he said. My uncle spoke of him until the day he died. He said your father pulled 3 men from the water at Corunna, and never once mentioned it after. He said there was no better man in the service, and no worse luck. Eleanor stood very still. No one had spoken her father's name to her with respect in 14 months. The creditors had spoken it. The physicians had spoken it. The lodging housekeeper in Bath had spoken it attached to the rent. But no one had said there was no better man, and the words went into her like warmth, into cold hands painful and necessary, and her composure held only because she had built it carefully and tested it often. He saw the cost of the holding. He did not remark on it, he said only, you should not be at the foot of that table. And she said, your aunt would disagree, and something happened at the corner of his mouth that on another man would have been the beginning of a smile. Over the following days the house settled into its season, and the season settled into its work, which was the making and unmaking of futures by the arrangement of bodies in rooms. Lady Drummond works tirelessly, and well, for she was good at it, better than anyone gave her credit for, having married a baronet on far thinner prospects than her daughter now enjoyed. She placed Cassandra at the pianoforte after dinner, where the candlelight was kindest, and the Earl was made to turn the pages, and Cassandra played the pieces she played best, and laughed at the places she had been taught to laugh. She placed Cassandra beside him on the morning rides, mounted on a gentle mare chosen to show a straight back to advantage, and Eleanor, who had ridden her father's hunters bareback across the Devon hills before she was 12 and could have outridden every soul in the party, was not invited and did not ask. And Lady Drummond, let it be known, in the gentle, poisonous way of women who have decided a thing and require only that the room agree, that the Vance girl was a charity case, a hanger-on living on the dead Earl's misplaced pity, a person of no family and no fortune and no escort, who had pushed herself into a gathering of her betters on the strength of a creased letter that would very likely not survive a solicitor's careful reading. The room heard it, and the room for a while believed it, because the room had been told. And a room would always rather be told than look-telling, being effortless, and looking being work. But Adrian had begun to look, and once a man like that begins to look, he cannot easily be made to stop. He found reasons. He found that the library wanted cataloguing, that 3 generations of Marbury Earls had bought books, and shelved none of them in any order a mind could follow, and that Miss Vance had a good hand and a better head for it. He found that the boy Thomas would eat his supper if Miss Vance read to him from the book of voyages he loved, and would not eat at all if she did not. He found that the long gray afternoons were shorter when there was a woman in them telling him plain true things in a plain true voice, that she did not flatter him as the others flattered him, that she would say a thing was foolish if it was foolish even when the thing was his, and that he had come to wait for those afternoons the way a man waits for a thaw. And he found with a kind of slow alarm that no expression on his still face betrayed, that he had begun to know exactly where she was in any room he entered, the way one knows where the fire is without looking at it, the way the body turns of its own accord toward warmth. He said nothing of any of this. He could not have found the words, and the words he could find were all the wrong shape, so he issued instructions instead. "Sit down," he said, when she had stood too long at the high shelves, and the color had gone from her face. "Eat something," he said, when she had pushed her plate away at the foot of the table. "Walk with me to the orangery. The light is going," when what he meant was that he could not let the day end without 1/4 hour in which she was the only other person in the world. The instructions were cold, level, the commands of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The man giving them was not cold at all, and Eleanor, who had trained herself to read what people meant under what they said, heard the warmth folded inside the order like a coal banked under ash, and did not dare believe it, because believing it was the most dangerous thing she could do, and she had run out of things she could afford to lose. Here is a thing worth saying. Once quietly, before the house turns colder, watch how a man who cannot say a soft word learns to make a hard one mean the soft thing instead. If this story is reaching you, stay until the end, because the woman at the foot of the table has further to fall before she is caught, and then the fire shifted in the grate, and the season went on. The midpoint of any gathering is the great ball, and the great ball at Harrowgate was the night Lady Drummond had chosen for her work to bear fruit. The ballroom was opened. The chandeliers were lit with 300 candles. The orchestra came from the county town, and the county itself poured in. Every family of consequence within 30 miles, the very witnesses whose opinions made and unmade a person. Eleanor had no gown for it. She had her one good gown, sponged and pressed, cream gone faintly to ivory with age, and she wore it without apology, and came down the great stair into a room blazing with diamonds she could not have bought with a year of the annuity she had come to claim. Lady Drummond saw her enter, and turned to the cluster of county wives at her side and said, in a voice pitched precisely to Carrie, "There's the creature who arrived without an escort, you will have heard, living on poor Marbury's charity and angling now for his nephew. A lady does not arrive without an escort, and a lady certainly does not stay where she is not wanted." The wives laughed, the small laugh that cost nothing. Eleanor heard it, as she was meant to. Her cheek stayed even. Her hand at her side closed once and opened. It was at that moment that she understood the true shape of the trap, because she saw the solicitor. He was a thin gray man in black, newly arrived, standing at the edge of the room, in conversation with Lady Drummond's brother, the entitled cousin Mr. Gear. Crane, who had been angling all season for the lapsed portions of the estate, and Eleanor understood with the cold clarity of a woman who has watched men decide her future before, that the letter that had summoned her was about to be read against her rather than for her, that Lady Drummond and Mr. Colberet, Crane between them, meant to have the codicil declared void, the charity withdrawn, the creature put out of the house before she could fix herself any more firmly in the new Earl's regard. She had come for a small annuity. She was about to be made an example. What she did then was the thing that decided everything, though she did not do it for effect, and no one but a child and a man in a doorway saw it done. The boy Thomas, overwhelmed by the noise and the 300 candles and the crush of strangers who smelled of powder and wine, had slipped from his nurse in the press and got himself to the edge of the ballroom, behind the great curtains where the cold came off the terrace doors. And he had begun the white-faced, silent panic Eleanor had seen in the churchyard. The panic of a child who has learned that crying brings no one. No one marked him. The room was watching the dancers turn under the chandeliers, the silks, and the diamonds, and the careful smiles. Eleanor marked him because she marked everything, and she crossed to him in her ivory gown in full view of anyone who cared to look, and no one did, and she knelt again, there on the polished floor at the edge of the most important night of her life, as she had knelt in the churchyard mud. And she took his cold hands in her gloved ones, and she talked him back from the edge of his fear in the low, even voice, about the music and the candles and the snow that would surely come before Christmas, and she did not return to the ballroom floor where her last chance to be seen as something other than a servant was draining away by the minute. She let him out instead, by a side door, to the quiet of the cold hall, choosing the frightened child over the blazing room without weighing it, because to Eleanor it did not require weighing. She did not know the Earl had followed. She did not know he had left Cassandra mid-sentence and Lady Drummond mid-triumph, and come to stand in the doorway and watch a penniless woman in an old gown choose his ward over her own deliverance. She knew only that the child was calm, and that this was enough, and that it had always been enough, and that this was perhaps the whole difference between her and the diamonds in the other room. That was the night Adrian Hale told her the thing he had told no one. They sat in the cold hall on a bench beneath a dark old portrait, the boy asleep at last against Eleanor's shoulder with his small fist closed in the ivory of her gown, and the ball roaring faintly behind the closed double doors, like weather in another country. And the Earl spoke into the dark in a voice she had not heard him use lower than his commands. Slower, a voice with the discipline gone out of it. He told her about the winter. He told her how his cousin, Thomas's father, had written to him 3 times from this very house, asking him to come, that there was sickness in the village, and the physician was old and the children were frightened, and how he had been in town, busy and important, and certain in the way that comfortable men are certain that there would be time enough later for everything that mattered. He told her how the fever had come up from the village and taken the whole household inside 11 days. His uncle, his cousin's wife, before he had so much as answered the 3rd letter. He had arrived to a house of closed shutters and a single surviving child, who did not know him. He told her he had inherited a title he had not earned by neglecting the one man who would have earned it, that every acre and every candle and every bowed head in the place was a thing he had come into over the bodies of better men. He told her the boy flinched from him because the boy was right to flinch, because he had not come when the coming would have mattered, and a child knows the difference between a man who arrives and a man who arrives too late. He took from his breast pocket as he spoke a folded letter gone soft as cloth at the creases, worn to the texture of skin by being carried and unfolded and folded again. The 3rd letter, the unanswered one, which he kept against his heart like a wound he would not permit to close, because closing it would have been a second abandonment. He had never shown it to a living soul. He unfolded it now in the cold hall, and let her see his cousin's hand, the ordinary urgent words of a man who had believed his summons would be answered. And Eleanor, who carried her own dead father in an oval frame on a borrowed mantle, and touched the glass each night the way other people said their prayers, understood that she was not the only person in that great house surviving on the discipline of a held expression, and that grief, when it is real, but folds itself small and carries itself close, and waits for one safe hand to be set down into. After that, the house felt the change in him before anyone could name it, and Lady Drummond, who made her living naming things, named it fastest. She saw the Earl's eyes find Eleanor across rooms. She saw him send the boy to Eleanor, and not to Cassandra. She saw the cataloguing of the library extend well past any reasonable need for cataloguing. And she understood that her season's work was failing, and she did what people do when the thing they have built begins to fall. She moved faster and harder. She went to the solicitor and to Mr. Crane, and she had the codicil examined, and the examination found what such examinations are paid to find: an ambiguity, a missing witness, a technical flaw. And on the strength of it, Mr. Bodden, Crane was advised that the bequest to Eleanor Vance could be set aside and the girl removed, and Lady Drummond saw to it that the removing would be done in public at the farewell dinner in front of the whole county, so that the lesson would be complete. The dinner was the dark moment, and it came as such things come, dressed as an ordinary evening. The table was laid for 40, the candles were lit. Eleanor was seated at the foot, as ever, and she did not yet know what was planned, only that the air had the wrongness it has before a blow. The soup was removed, the fish was removed. And then Mr. Bray. Crane rose with the solicitor's paper in his hand and said, with the smooth regret of a man enjoying himself, that a painful matter must be addressed before the company, that the late Earl's codicil had been found defective, that the person presently enjoying the family's hospitality under its terms had no legal claim upon the estate and never had, and that it grieved him. It grieved him deeply to observe that the lady had, after all, arrived without an escort, and would now regrettably be departing in much the same condition. Lady Drummond said it then for the third time, savoring it, turning the words like a key in a lock. "A lady does not arrive without an escort," the county murmured. 40 faces turned toward the foot of the table to watch the creature receive her sentence. Eleanor stood. She did not weep, and she did not plead, because she had decided long ago in a cold room in Bath that whatever they took from her, they would not take the way she stood when they took it. She said, in a voice that carried the length of the table without rising, that she had come on the strength of her father's name and not her own, that Captain Vance had pulled 3 men from the sea at Corunna and asked nothing, and that she would leave as she had come, owing no one and ashamed of nothing, and that the gentleman might keep the annuity and welcome to it, for she had discovered she had not, after all, come for the money, and she gathered her gloves to go. It was the truest thing she had said in 14 months, and it cost her everything she had left. And she turned from the table with her chin level and her composure whole, prepared to walk out of the great house and back into the gray, alone, as a lady apparently must not. But as this lady... He crossed the room in 3 strides. The whole table saw the Earl of Marbury rise from his place at the head and come down the length of it, past the diamonds and the candles and the turned astonished faces, and stop before the gray-cloaked woman at the foot, and the room went so silent that the candles could be heard to gutter. He took the solicitor's paper from Mr. Ballard Ronix. Crane's hand without a word, and he held it to the nearest flame and let it burn, and as it burned, he turned to the county that had come to watch a woman put out of his house, and he spoke once, level and low and final. "Miss Vance leaves here as my wife." The silence held for the length of 3 heartbeats, and into it the letter paper finished burning, and Lady Drummond's fan stopped half-lifted in her hand, and Cassandra's pretty taut composure broke into something young and lost, and Mr. Plecty. Crane sat down very suddenly as though his legs had been removed. The Earl did not look at any of them. He looked only at Eleanor, and he turned his hand palm up between them, an offer, and not a command, for the first time since she had known him, and he waited, in front of 40 witnesses, for her to decide. Mrs. Pennock, at the side door, pressed her square gray hand to her mouth. And old Lord Aldous, the senior peer of the county, whose word settled what the county thought, set down his glass and said into the silence, in a voice dry as autumn leaves, that he had known Captain Vance, that the man had been worth 10 of anyone presently objecting, and that he for one would dance at the wedding. The county, which would rather be told than look, was being told, and began slowly to look, and to see at last what had been at the foot of the table all along. Eleanor put her hand in his. She did it not because the room had turned, though it had, and not because the danger had passed, though it had, but because the man holding out his hand had shown her a soft letter against his heart, and let her see the wound in him, and she had decided that she would rather be poor beside an honest grief than safe beside a comfortable lie. Her hand in his was steady, the pulse in her wrist was not, and he could feel it, and the corner of his mouth did the thing that on another man would have been a smile, and on him was something larger and quieter and harder won. They were married at the old grey chapel by the churchyard. 3 weeks later, on a morning when the first snow came down, soft and slow over the leaning stones, and there were not 300 candles, and there was not a county in attendance, only Mrs. Pennock and old Lord Aldous and the boy Thomas, who stood between them at the altar because Eleanor had asked that he should, and who did not flinch when the Earl put a hand on his shoulder, because somewhere in the long autumn the flinching had quietly stopped. If Eleanor's journey has stayed with you, stay a moment longer, for there is one more small thing the story has been carrying all along, and it is waiting on a mantel. That evening the three of them sat by the fire in the small east passage room that Eleanor had refused to give up, because it was the first place in the house that had been kind to her. And the snow came down past the window she had now claimed as her own, and the boy slept warm between them on the hearthrug, and on the narrow mantel where it had sat since the first cold night she arrived alone, stood her father's miniature, the little oval portrait of the young laughing Captain Vance, who had pulled 3 men from the sea and asked nothing, and beside it now lay the soft folded letter, the third letter, the unanswered one, set down at last and let to rest. 2 wounds, laid side by side and finally still. Eleanor reached up once and touched the frame, as she had touched it every night, and this time her hand was perfectly steady, and so was the pulse in her wrist, and outside the snow went on falling soft over the chapel and the leaning stones and the new grass that would come. The lady had arrived without an escort. She would never again leave without a home. Thank you for staying to the end of Eleanor's story. If it moved you, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you, and rest a while by the fire before you go.